What's going on, beautiful J4 family and community? Thank you guys for joining me on a Sunday. Truly appreciate it. Hope your weekend was wonderful, that you had a chance to connect with your family, your people, your social networks, and you're having a restful weekend ready for the work week next week. So today I wanted to again say thank you to all those who recently subscribed and added to the Watch Hour account. We truly appreciate that. It's been a joy project for us, two fathers, two sons, chopping it up around this wonderful thing called life. But then more recently, after a video called White Mothers and Their Biracial Black Sons, we had tremendous interest in the subject matter, which has caused me to shift just a little bit to still stay in the parenting space, which is kind of ultimately the goal, to create grounded, healthy, solid, independent sons and daughters, but to also recognize not a new phenomenon, but recognize a contemporary reality in the United States of America, and that there's a lot of interest, a lot of dialogue, a lot of stuff going on in these YouTube streets in the interracial space, or to say it more specifically, the biracial space, mixed light skin space, multi-generationally mixed kind of space. And so I decided I would try to merge the two concepts to do a little bit more by way of research in the interracial or biracial space because of these factors here. I was born in 1968, so racially I'm a biracial kid. At that time, I pathway towards a blackness. I think you would call that sort of black identifying. Okay. And that's kind of the framework of which I've done most of my content. But I've also had some very interesting and extensive commentary and feedback and communication with a younger generation of beautiful young folks who are experiencing different ways or different identity dynamics when it comes to culture, right? So racially, they're biracial, but culturally, they're declaring and making various levels of arguments and cases for a request, not a request, but for a declaration of more of a biracial distinctive identity culturally. And then there's movements and desires to do that from a legislative kind of perspective, which might be the next step, I would imagine. And so it's all been very fascinating to me. It's all been very fascinating, in part because I do a lot of work with beautiful young men, many of which are biracial, many of which are sort of going through their own identity politics, but also as a father of biracially presenting children. Their mother's an African American woman, but they kind of share my absence of melanin. And so they move through the world, at least thought of as biracial. And we raised them to have a sort of a black cultural framework. And in talking with them, they're not expressing some of the sentiments I'm picking up from some of the other folks in the community here. But nonetheless, I believe each person has their own way of self-validating, their own way of moving through the world. And it's been fascinating. So I've enjoyed listening in on the conversation and kind of just trying to get my mind around what is undoubtedly a communication or a desire that's going to stay. It's going to stay, y'all. So 3% of interracial marriages when I was born, 1967, that's a data set, first data set I saw, at least in the modern era. Biracial nuance has been around since human beings of different backgrounds are interacted. But in the modern era, the first data I see is 1967. 3% of marriages were interracial. I was born in 1968. But if you fast forward to a contemporary time, roughly about 17% of all newlyweds are interracial in some combination of white, Asian, Native American, white, Latino, black, whatever the case may be. So that data set is for those individuals from two different cultural heritages, right? So it's not just a black-white dynamic. So 17% of all newlyweds are going to be interracial marriages, and at the moment are producing over 30 million people who are identified as either two or more races, biracial or two or more races. That's roughly 10% of the population. And if you look at growth trajectory, the only community that is not continuing to marry in increasing numbers interracially is Asian. At one time, the Asian community was, I believe, either first or second in terms of interracial marriage configuration, but they're the only population in the community that are going down in their percentage of marriages to people from different races or cultural backgrounds than themselves, and all the rest of them are continuing to project upward. And so that would suggest to me that the interracial marriages are going to increase, and they're going to continue to produce biracial babies. And there's a unique dynamic there because the numbers just didn't warrant sort of this self-declaration of independent identity in my generation. But as the numbers swell, as this internet becomes a platform for voices, for community, for dialogue, for combative interaction, beautiful biracial folks are going to, I think, continue to assert themselves, and for a declaration that acknowledges both love sources. It acknowledges mama, and it also acknowledges daddy. To where in my generation, we certainly had love for our mothers. In this case, my mother's a white European woman, but we tended not to move or declare that publicly. We tend to just move towards black spaces and navigate it family nuance on the back end. But today's generation, rightfully so, is saying, no, no, we're going to represent both love sources in a way that is indicative and accurate. And they're doing that in profound and unique and beautiful, complex kinds of ways. And so today I want to talk about the title, which is Interracial Marriage Across the United States. Because one thing, when families get together, they say, hey, where are we going to live? Right? Where are we going to live? And a lot of times they'll pick communities for a host of different reasons. Perhaps they want to be in a more diverse kind of environment. Perhaps they want to be more in a rural kind of experience, or they want to be in an urban, metropolitan, bustling kind of space. Or sometimes they might want to live in predominantly monolithic kinds of spaces. But one thing I'm pretty sure, if you have an interracial couple, they are asking questions about where do we want to live? And in part, they're asking that from a framework of what kind of educational system do I want my child to be exposed to? What kind of neighborhoods and cities do I want my child to be exposed to? Who do I want them to have proximity to, which is a significant part of identity formation? And then also, what kind of social networks? What kind of social networks do I want to have access to? And in their thinking, they might want to say, hey, we certainly want our child to have exposure to mama's culture, and we certainly want our child to have exposure to dad's culture. We'll certainly do our due diligence in educating them in various ways about the uniqueness of their duality, right? The uniqueness, and that could be intellectually, educationally, conversely, joining organizations, whatever the case may be. But I imagine somewhere in the thinking of the parents, they're saying, hey, will my child be around with any significance proportionately to people who are also living a similar life experience, other biracial children? And those biracial children can create communities and support systems and peer groups and opportunities just to express themselves in age appropriate kinds of ways. And particularly if parents are in this space and they're listening to young biracial voices and some of the challenges and angst they've had in monolithic acceptance, maybe they're wanting to shield their beautiful seeds from that or mitigate that in some capacity. And one of the ways to do that is to identify cities and neighborhoods and states that are more inclusive or more representative of the particular construct that their family also represents. So that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. Mulatto Vanguard, how you doing? Good to see you. Respect to the stream. Appreciate you. All right. So let's just conversate a little bit here. I'm going to just share with you some data, kind of where the clusters of interracial marriages are, and by de facto of that, where there's large populations of biracial kids throughout the United States of America. Maybe it's just interesting information to you. It's interesting to me, but also maybe for parents, of which this channel kind of is oriented to, it might, affirm things you already knew, or it might identify some metropolitan areas that you hadn't thought about, and maybe you make choices about where you want to go, because the nation is much more mobile. People aren't, sort of growing up and living in the same neighborhoods. They tend to be mobile, whether that's for education, whether that's for career opportunity, promotion and jobs, right? But the nation is mobile, And increasingly, people are looking at what cities they want to move to, and among many variables are what's the quality of life, what's the cost of living, what type of homes can be purchased, right? What type of educational systems there are, but in a more sophisticated way, what are the demographics? What is the populace that my child will grow up with? Because ultimately, where you live is a tremendous influence on the quality of experience of life that your beautiful seeds will have. And as all parents, one thing that we are sort of always or should be driving towards is to create the best possible scenarios for our children so that they can then take these experiences and manage an adult life, and then generationally, communities and families continue to elevate and advance the family name and status. And so where you live and the demographic makeup of that city might be of interest to you. So let me share my screen. And if y'all have any questions as I'm going through this, feel free to throw them up. I will open it up for any questions anyone has towards the end there, and then we'll see what happens. So let me share here. Okay. So first of all, where am I getting this information from? The link is actually in the description if you want to play around in it a little bit more. It's a fascinating article. It's interactive, which I'll show you here in the middle in a minute. But Pew Research Center is where I'm pulling this data from. And it's a Pew Research Center is basically an institute that uses the U.S. Census data, its raw data, to tell narratives and stories about a particular community, about the United States of America across a range of different variables. And one thing we talked about in the 9 criteria for biracial to become its own independent identity, some things would need to happen in the society. And one of them is to be able to say something about that particular community. And one of the ways that is done is through research by reputable institutions doing research in a variety of different kind of ways, dissecting the information, parsing it out, and then making comparisons. Because one thing about a culture, the action of culture is to work for its improvement. And the only way you know where you're doing well, where you're healthy at, and where you're not so healthy, where you need to improve, is to study and have examine research, to examine data sets. And then based upon data that you feel is problematic for your particular culture, then in a variety of different ways, you move towards solving cultural problems. And so if you're able to tell a story about a biracial community or collective of people where there's doing well and where there's problems, and then if you're culturally centered, in this case, Black culture or biracial culture, whatever the case may be, your action is then to seek to improve those particular conditions. So research is a critical part of any cultural sort of foundation and sort of self-standing. So Pew Research Center is where we got the data from. All right. So here you see an interactive map of the United States. And let me throw a caveat up front. Geography is not my strong subject matter. And so we'll have to work through that part here. But you'll see at the bottom the share of intermarried couples across the United States from less than 10%, between 10 and 14%, between 15 and 19%, which is where the current average is of interracial marriages of roughly 17% of newlyweds. So that's kind of the middle point. But then, as evidenced by these two remaining statistical ranges, you'll see some areas in the United States of America have a higher proportionality of interracial marriages than the average. And they broke those down by 20 to 24%, and then 25% and above. Okay, so let's see where interracial folks are being married. If you guys are just joining me, welcome. Truly appreciate you being here. Love to know who I'm shopping with. All right. So if we look to the east, sort of the southeast kind of corridor, where those are about less than 10%. And I will say up front, not all states will have any percentages. So in looking at the article, if there were less than 200 cases of interracial marriage, they didn't include it in the data set. And again, it's not by the totality of the state, it's by a metropolitan area. So the city clusters. So not all states will be represented in this graph, but those who have 200 or more interracial marriages are included. So we're looking down here in Louisiana. We have Lafayette, 9% of newlyweds are intermarried. Baton Rouge, 8% of newlyweds are intermarried. All right. We got a strong Creole, light skinned culture down there. Anyway, Jackson, Mississippi, 3%. All right. This is the South, hardcore South, rigid raciality. That kind of makes sense. Then we're moving over to Alabama, 6% of newlyweds in Birmingham. All right. Birmingham, that's interesting. That's where Bull Connor was from. And then moving on up a little bit, we got Chattanooga, Tennessee. 5% of newlyweds are intermarried there. Then we're moving over to South Carolina. I was just in South Carolina. Greenville, Andersons, I think that's 6%. Okay. And then we're moving up to Asheville, North Carolina, 3%. Moving over to Greensboro, North Carolina, 9%. Okay, 9%. Louisville in Kentucky, 9%. Okay. Cincinnati, Ohio, 9%. All right. And then we have Youngstown, Warren in Ohio, Philadelphia area, and then Scranton up in Pennsylvania. Okay. So less than 10%, we see kind of where those clusters are. So interracial marriages in the South, certainly in the East, but at the lower end of it. All right. So are any of your cities or where you're from represented here? I don't know. So let's take that down a minute. Let's see where 10% to 14% are. All right, we are still in the South, the East, moving Midwest a bit. Texas is represented in McAllen. That's the sort of the southern tip of Texas. 11%. Beaumont, Port Arthur, Texas, 11%. Okay. Then we got a little, it's Beaumont still. Okay, we're adding in a few places here in Alabama, 10% in Mobile. Florida's kind of represented over here, North Point, Cape Coral. Okay, all right. Big cluster here, Atlanta, Sandy Springs, and Georgia. All right. Over here in Illinois, we got St. Louis. Makes sense. Indianapolis. All right. So these are between 10 and 14% of interracial marriages in these particular metropolitan areas. Columbus, Ohio, coming in at 11%. Again, these are all below the national average. Currently, 17% of all interracial marriages are interracial. So these are places that have some interracial marriages, but not at the national average. What's Detroit talking about? Detroit, 10%. Okay. These are predominantly black cities. Milwaukee, 13%. What do we have over here? In Iowa, if that's Des Moines, okay. And then let's head over here to New York, Syracuse, Albany, okay. Providence, Springfield, Philadelphia, 14%. We have something here on the coast, Salisbury, Delaware, 10%. And then finally, Richmond, Virginia. All right. Now we have the first appearance from the West Coast. The West Coast represented over here. The side, California, 11%. Provo, Utah. Wow. Okay, that's surprising. Utah, 14%. Okay. So I don't know if you're represented there. Love to know where you're from, what city you kind of grew up, see if it's represented here. Now we are in the national average. This is the national average range between 15 and 19%. And again, parents, particularly if you're in interracial marriages and you're thinking about where to raise your babies, we're sharing with you a data set from a clustering of interracial marriages at varying percentages. We looked at less than 10%, we looked at 10 to 14%, and here is 15 to 19%, which is consistent with the national average of 17%. All right, we're up in the, I don't know what you would call it, the east, north. Spokane, Washington, 17%. Okay, they're consistent with the average. Then we jump over here to Portland, 19%. Okay, interracial. I don't think there's too many black folk out there. I could be wrong. Salt Lake City, Utah. Okay, this is stereotypically surprising. Okay. Santa Rosa, California, 19%. Salinas, California, 16, and then Bakersfield, 17%. Okay. And then we jump over here to Colorado, 18%. All right. Texas is starting to represent itself. Dallas-Fort Worth corridor. Okay. And then also in the Houston area. Houston, 19%. All right. New Orleans. Okay. New Orleans is at 16% on par with the national average. Pensacola, Florida's picking up a few more areas. Jacksonville, Lakeland. Okay. I feel like this is the presidential elections. You know, they Wolf and them guys on the blue screen. Charlotte, Concordia, North Carolina, 16. Okay. All right. Raleigh, North Carolina. All right. Let's look at this cluster here. This is the DMV area, 19%. Okay. What's up in there? Illinois, Chicago at 19%. Okay. New York, New Jersey, 18%. That's a major metropolitan corridor. DC, we did that already. And then Rochester, New York. All right. So that was the 15 to 19%. We're beginning to see a stratification, a diversification across the United States. Lower percentages tend to be in the South, moving towards the East, like a meteor report, right? The weather report. It still picks up a little bit in the West in the next category, but on average, you're seeing some distribution, but more notably, you're seeing greater numbers start to show up on the West Coast, all right, on the West Coast. Now, this category here will be higher than the national average. Okay, this is higher than the national average. Okay. Again, we're still up here in Washington, 20% in Seattle. Okay. Eugene, all right, that's where Nike's from. The Nike family. Boise, Idaho. All right, Las Vegas hits the map for the first time. Reno, all right. Fresno, California area. San Jose area, 24%. Los Angeles, 22%. Okay. Denver, 22%. El Paso, Texas, okay, 22%. Oklahoma City, 23%. San Antonio, definitely. A lot of Latino there, 23%. Austin, yep. Corpus Christi. Tennessee coming in with 21%. Florida's again representing Gainesville, 22%. Tampa. Orlando. Miami, Fort Lauderdale, 24%. Virginia Beach, Virginia, okay, 20%. We're back in Ohio area, 20%, and then Michigan, 20%. All right. So now we're starting to see less in the South, less in the East in terms of being over 20 to 24%. But then we're starting to see a few more numbers starting in Texas and then moving westward, outward. I'm sure this correlates with history and migration patterns in some kind of way. Also, if you look at the newness of states, new states tend not to have some of the racial rigidity of other kinds of states, given history and formation. And then finally, over 25%. Over 25%. Anchorage, Alaska is 28%. I think this is Hawaii. Yeah, Hawaii is the highest at 42%. We're heavy here in Arizona, Phoenix, Mesa, Scottsdale area, and Tucson are 25%. Albuquerque, New Mexico, 28%. California is here, 25%. In Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego areas was 27%. Santa Maria, 30%. Sacramento, Stockton, all the Bay Area, upwards of 25%. And then we jump over here to Utah again, 27%. Now they're doing the interracial thing big in Utah. And then Las Vegas, Nevada, 31%. Las Vegas is also a very high percentage of interracial marriage. Again, Hawaii is at 42%, but Vegas and two other cities, I believe, are over 30%. And then hanging here in the South, Palm Bay, 29%, and then finally Fayetteville, North Carolina. If you put it all together, 10% or less, 10 to 14%, 15 to 19%, 20 to 24%, 25% and up. So with the exception of this mid US corridor here, this almost latitude line, whatever the case may be. And again, you can see states that had no representation, meaning 200 or less marriages were interracial. They weren't included in this data set. But here's the distribution pattern and cluster of interracial marriages across the United States in major metro areas. But again, if you guys are thinking about how you want to live, where you want to live, what kind of experiences you want for your biracial children, this is 20 to 25% and above, or to stay with the national average. 17% of current newlyweds are interracial marriages. This is where they are geographically dispersed. This is where they are geographically dispersed. All right. So let me stop there, see if there's any questions. If not, this could just be a little Sunday quick one, just sharing you information. You know, as families, you want to make decisions about where you raise your children, who you raise them around, educational systems, opportunities for social interaction, school environments that leads to sports, community organizations. What's the diversity like? Do you want an urban center? Are you looking for more of a rural place? Do you want inter-income, so multi-income kind of environments? Do you want to be in a city that you have to have extensive integrated transportation systems, or do you have to have a car to travel? Do you want to train? Do you want to be able to get to multiple states and cities within a 6-hour radius, right? All of these are decisions that families make, and I believe increasingly so, interracial marriages, as they increase, producing more biracial babies, where you live from a child-rearing perspective will be critically or increasingly more of interest to you, or if not a priority for you. And so here's a data set that kind of lets you know where families are in similar, at least makeups, interracial marriages, biracial kids, where they're clustering across the United States. And if that's important to you, there's the data. If it's not important to you, no problem at all. No problem at all. All right, so let me stop sharing. All right, beautiful family. Let me get this here, see if there's any questions. Initially, I want to see if you have any questions about the data set here, if it's interesting to you, if it makes sense from your thought process, or if you have any thoughts about why these certain areas are populated the way they are. Love to talk about that. And then we can certainly open it up if there's any broader questions in the space of parenting or identity dynamics. So if anyone is interested, let me give you a couple of minutes to kind of get logged in here. Those of you listening in, there's a few of y'all. Appreciate that. Truly appreciate that. If you came to us by way of the white mothers and their black biracial sons, thank you guys so much. That was a very enjoyable conversation between Gene and I. There was a lot of comments on it. Definitely recommend to check that out. It was our story. It was sort of disclosing and revealing, and us kind of talking about our pathway into a blackness. But it was also spoken by people who are, in their 50s. And today's generation has a different kind of voice and a different kind of experience. And so increasingly, I think more and more interracial couples are going to need to be sophisticated when they're birthing babies who are essentially a new identity, because you'll have the monolithic parent, two monolithic parents, assumingly, who have had an identity formation experience. And they've now produced a child who they love, of course, and will nurture and protect and guide and provide exposure and opportunity. But that child will move through a society with this duality in terms of their identity, and they're going to encounter certain things. They're going to feel certain kind of ways. They're going to be treated in certain kind of ways. They're going to move and assert themselves in certain kind of ways. And as parents, you'll understand that broadly and categorically, but you won't understand it from the perspective where you have two love sources who come from historically different kinds of backgrounds that are all manifested or represented in the beautiful seed. You understand coming of age typically from two monolithic parents where it was almost unspoken because it was just obvious to where an interracial kid, the dynamic of managing two identities, two cultural communities is very prevailing, it's very dominant, it's very front and center on the thinking and mindset of the beautiful young people. And so they may be in this identity space in more intense and protracted or longer ways than you were when you were just going through human development and coming of age through various stages. And so it's important that you all think critically, beautiful families, mom and dad, about how you're raising your children. And a part of how is tied to where. A part of how is tied to where. Where do you raise your children? And certainly, despite the population representation, what intentionality do you and father do, or you and mother do, in order to provide the best exposure and opportunity for a healthy sense of coming of age and identity formation in your beautiful seeds? A part of that is community. A part of that is proximity to other young children or teenagers who come from similar configurations of family construct and structure. All right. So let me just take a couple more minutes here. If y'all want to come in and chop it up, I see a couple of new folks. We earlier on went through the U.S. graph, kind of in metro clusters where interracial couples are based upon marital status. We showed less than 10%, 10 to 14%, 14 to 20%, 20 to 25%, and beyond, and where these clusters of interracial families live throughout the United States. I share that for a point of interest of my own. I actually live in a city that is 25% or more. That's not surprising. I did grow up in Vegas. I wasn't attuned to the environment that much back then, but that also makes sense. But you're seeing large interracial clustering primarily in the West, especially 20% and above. The average, as an aggregate of the U.S., is 17% of newlyweds are interracial marriages, and that number is continuing to grow. It's continuing to grow, and with the exception of the Asian, Asia Pacific American community, all other cultural communities are intermarrying, and that number is just going to increase and increase. Right now, there are over 30 million, over 10% of the human population in the United States considers themselves two or more races. That's just the children. Okay, that's just the children. And I share this because in the modern era, and in the modern era, at least as it relates to interracial conversations and biracial children, I'm using the 1967 Loving Act as sort of the last discriminatory, misogynistic law being removed, and then America moving forward absent the discrimination factor or the misogynistic law in 17 states. I'm calling that the modern era for interracial data sets and biracial data sets. And more young people today are expressing frustration with trying to enter into a blackness. They feel the gatekeeping there is something that cannot be overcome. There's perceptions or testimony around the sort of interaction or challenges both on the internet and in some instances in persons. And so, biracial people are choosing to make other kinds of decisions around identity formation and community building. And I think that's a question that will not go away. That's going to remain a question. It's going to remain an issue. I think there's ample examples in the society where interracial families are becoming normalized, and biracial children, by way of de facto of that, are becoming normalized. And as that happens, then the dynamics and the tension between monolithic historical communities, biracial communities, that might kind of become tenuous and strenuous here for a period of time. Hopefully that will subside. I certainly hope that. But the dynamic of identity assertion by a community that is continuing to grow and to grow and to grow, that is inevitable. And I think that's going to have implications politically. I think it'll have implications in terms of popular culture, but it'll also have implications on what families decide to do. And a part of what they decide to do is they want to live in communities that minimize pressure, that minimizes frustration, that minimizes potential threat or disunity imposed upon their children, and they're going to gravitate towards environments where that is less of an issue, and they can get to the core dynamics of parenting, which is raising your children, character management, age appropriate behavioral management, education, social systems, and community opportunities to join, to lead, to grow, and to contribute to things that are age appropriate as a family unit. So let me see if there's anybody wants to come up with any questions. Because there's some new faces in here, let me just reshare the chart. Let me just reshare the chart. This is where 10% of interracial, less than 10% of interracial marriages exist as clusters in the United States of America. So we're seeing Louisiana over here, Mississippi, Alabama, coming up into Illinois and Indiana, and even a bit over here in Pennsylvania. If you add the next category of people, that's 10 to 14%. We begin to see the West show up for the first time, particularly in the South Central California area, and then Utah, which is pretty representative, and then other kinds of states like Kansas and Iowa, Kansas again, and a few more in Jackson, Mississippi, Louisiana. It's a little bit here in Texas. If you add in 15 to 19%, which is the national average, you'll begin to see the West become more populated, and in certain clusters, particularly here on the East, Texas starting to show itself and representing. And then when you get into 20% or more, we are looking at largely again in the West, stretching all the way up to the north. Texas showing a little bit here, El Paso, Utah strongly represented, and then also Denver's in the house, even on the tip of the Florida handle there, Miami. And then finally, if you add in where the majority of interracial couples exist by way of marital status and census review, they live primarily on the West, with Hawaii being the strongest one with 42%, Anchorage, Alaska knocking on 30%. If you look up here at Las Vegas, 31%, and then Arizona and both Tucson and Phoenix metropolitan area, over 25%. So again, families, if you're interracial or if you just want to be around that type of demographic makeup, here's some of the data for you. But again, as I talked about, one of the most important decisions parents can make is about where you raise your babies. Nothing will be a utopia. Nothing will be 100% checking all your boxes. But the kind of environment that your children grow up in, particularly biracial kids, where identity formation is critical to a healthy sense of self, it's helpful. It's helpful if they can interact and see people who share, at least phonetically, similar kind of phenotypes and identity nuances them. All right. We'll give you a couple more minutes, see if there's anyone has any questions, comments, disagreements, whatever the case may be. Again, as I get ready to close, this is a parenting-centered channel. Initially started as two dads chopping it up with their sons, 18-year-old sons who were starting college, had some great conversations in the earlier phases there. As life got busy for them, I decided I wanted to continue to do it. Recently did a presentation called White Mothers and Their Black Biracial Sons that just went viral, at least for our world. Has over 34,000 views, 600 plus comments. We got a lot of feedback, a lot of interesting commentary. A lot of folks don't think biracial kids are Black. That was interesting to me. Some folks think they are, but nonetheless, it let me know that there's some high interest in this discussion. And you can simply search YouTube and you see that there's a lot of current discussions going on about it. And it's getting tense in some instances. It's a high intensity kind of conversation. And I believe after all the fire, fury, and fervor calms itself, the question will remain. And that is, how do biracial kids go through identity formation? Some will pathway the way I did. They'll become Black identifying. A lot of that will have to do with the parents, kind of decisions they make. But I think a lot of them will choose to create and align with something that's more consistent with a biracial identity or a mixed identity or a multi-generationally mixed identity, whatever the case may be. I'm discovering new terminology here. Once they get past this fire, fury, and frustrated phase and things clear out, the question of identity will still remain. And there's some unique and very thoughtful conversations that are going on in that space. It's an important one to have. I'm personally interested in it. To me, I see it as an anthropological social construction. Something being born before our eyes right here in these virtual streets and spaces. It's fascinating to me, but regardless of that, demographically, the U.S. has always been in shifts and adjustments, and different kind of populations asserting themselves in different kind of ways. But the more and more people that come from a similar heritage construct, the more and more people that's produced, they'll begin to form, to bond, to advocate, to lobby for things that are going to be in their natural best interest. All groups do that historically, and all groups will do that contemporary, and all groups will do that going into the future. It's just a part of human phenomena. If you see yourself in the populace, in the sphere, in significant numbers, at some point you will gravitate, and at some point some cohesion will come out of that. Some sort of glue will come out of that helps in identity formation. And as all cultures should do, culture should be an instruction source. Culture should be a loving source, a sense of belonging, but it also ought to be a space that advocates for messages, signals to each other, things that ought to be a priority. Once you can examine and study a group, you can understand where it's good, where it's problematic, what it needs to improve upon. And then that becomes the action agenda of the culture, of the leadership, of the rituals, of the routines, of the nuance of the particular culture, is to improve its particular condition. That is the action of culture. And I believe as biracial kids continue to populate the society, they're 10% right now, they're going to ask questions that are historically different than the one that I asked. Again, as a biracial kid that culturally is Black identifying, those were my options. It was a singular option at the time, or at least in my age set, is what I was willing to accept, perhaps blindly. But nonetheless, today's generation, rightfully so, is asking different kind of questions. So on that note, please take a look at some of the other videos that will populate themselves here. Again, it's in the theme of rearing children. I'm putting a bit more emphasis on biracial kids, mixed kids, multi-generational kids, because I do think they have a uniqueness. There is a uniqueness. Most children look for guidance and understanding upwards. They look at the old people. They look at their parents. They look at their grandparents, right? But if you have a biracial kid living in a modern era, looking up at one parent that has a certain kind of experience, born in a different generation, and they're looking at the other parent, a different kind of monolithic experience, born in a different generation, they don't necessarily then have sort of intuitive understanding how to manage moments, because they are a mix of the two parents and are trying to figure that out, often without a guide, often without a model, right? Often without example. And so many videos that we talk about on this are different ways to support your beautiful babies, your seeds, sons or daughters, transition from the very critical age after puberty, which is where their body and their mind and their physicality goes through a different kind of phase, and a sense of belonging and membership is hyper important at that particular phase. So if you see value in those conversations, take a look. Love to have you become a part of the community. On behalf of J4 Conversations, thank you so much. Love, love, love.